All right, so welcome to week 6, chapter 7, licensing regulations. We're going to be going over this chapter today. It might even be shorter than an hour, we'll see. Anyway, welcome to chapter 7. We're going to go over a few of the licensing regulations that you'll need to know as part of this test bank questions. Okay, so starting with 7-1 in the book. It says, what agency regulates the rules for amateur radio service in the U.S.? The answer is the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. So within the U.S., it's the FCC. Outside of the U.S., there are other organizations across countries and those who are a party to what is known as the ITU, International Telegraph Union, I think. We'll get into that in a little bit later, but they regulate cross-country communication. So we'll get into that later. But the FCC, that's the organization that does that. So you're always bound by FCC rules in the U.S. Which of the now 7-2? Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose for amateur radio service? Okay, so they have 5 parts of the reason the amateur radio service, or ham, bands exist. What is your raison d'être, as they say in French? What is your reason for being? The first one is recognition and enhancement of the value of amateur service to the public as a voluntary, non-commercial communication service, particularly with respect to providing emergency communications. So the first thing they list is non-commercial, can't be paid, and the other thing is emergency communications. So that's one of the primary reasons, I would say. That's under A on 7.2. B on 7.2, continuation and extension of amateurs' proven ability to contribute to the advancement of the radio art. So the advancing of radio art. Number 3, or C, encouragement and improvement of the amateur service through rules which provide for advancing skills in both the communications and the technical phases of the art. So in other words, technical and communication of radio in general. So the next one, D, or number 4, expansion of the existing reservoir within the amateur radio service of trained operators, technicians, and electronics experts. So in other words, to have a pool of people who know about radio and electronics. And number 5 on 7-3, continuation and extension of the amateur's unique ability to enhance international goodwill. So kind of like a foreign exchange student for academia, it's like foreign exchange for communications and goodwill between countries. The quote they have here is, it is said that the ham radio is an international passport to friendship. So I have actually communicated through IRLP nodes to other people in other countries like Australia and England and stuff, and it's kind of fun to hear their accent and to hear about what's going on in those other countries. So those are the 5 reasons for amateur radio. Okay. The next one, this is a pretty easy one on 7-3. How many operator/primary station license grants may be held by one person? The answer is 1 and only 1. Okay, so they explain in 7.3 that the radio license consists of 2-part, an operator license and a station license. So for example, a radio station like KSL has a license to operate and transmit on the AM frequency 1160 in the US from Salt Lake City, originating from there. But then they have an operator license that allows them to actually operate the station. And they're 2 different licenses. Well, in ham radio, it's both. You have a license to operate and a right to, or a license to have a station that has the equipment needed to transmit. So there are 2 licenses in one, you might say. Which license classes are new licenses currently available from the FCC? There's 3, technician, general, and extra. So technician is VHF, UHF bands, and certain bands that we've went over before. And then general just gives you more access to different bands and modes. And then extra also just opens up more bands and modes. So those are the 3 license classes. There are others that used to exist that have since been sunsetted or no longer issued. Those include on 7.3, the second to the last paragraph, it says novice, technician plus, and advanced. So novice used to be what technician is now, and technician plus indicated you passed the Morse code test. And so you used to be able to have to know Morse code for what the technician does today. And then there was an advanced one. So those three are sunsetted. They're no longer used. You won't have to know those. But the question is, what are the three license classes? The answer is technician, general, and extra. Okay, what T1F11 in the middle of 7.3. Which of the following is a requirement for the issuance of a club station's license grant? So if you want to have a radio club, the requirement is you have to have at least 4 people. And there's an FCC rule. So there's a section of the federal law code known as Part 97. So 97 has to do with amateur radio. And it says 97.5B, there's a section in there that gives you the rules for it. But I think all you have to know is that it's 4 people to form a club. And if you want to operate something like, say, a repeater, there's a trustee who holds the license and is designated by a club officer, and they have to follow certain rules. I don't know what rules they are beyond that, but that's probably all you need to know for the test. And then the next page, 7.4, they actually give you an example, official example of what, or say, it says official copy, but it's unofficial, an example of what a license station's grant looks like. There's a top part that's a little bit bigger, and then there's a bottom part that's smaller. The idea is you print it off your own and you cut it up and fold it. And so the bottom part you would fold and put it in your wallet or purse, and then the top part is intended to be a larger version of the same thing that you can hang up at home or wherever you're at. So a couple of things to note here about that license. It's got the licensee, the name of the person, and their address. You can put a P.O. box if you want to preserve your privacy, because this will be public record. Anybody can look up your call sign and know your address. So if you're concerned about privacy, you can do a P.O. box. It has the grant date. There is a question on the test of how long is your license good for. It's good for a period of 10 years. So it's got the grant date here in this example and the expiration date. And then there's a file number, and it tells you what class, like in this example here, it's technician. And so those are the primary things that are on there. All right. Going on to 7.5, there are what are called elements, test elements. There's element 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 is probably what used to be the ones that are phased out that I just mentioned a minute ago, advanced, and some of those others. They have since done away with that. So there's only 3 test bank questions. Element 2 is technician, element 3 is general, and element 4 is extra. So element 2 has 35 questions. Passing grade is 26 or more questions out of 35. Same thing for the general. It used to be a general was like 50 questions. They've reduced it to 35. And then the extra is 50 questions. Passing is a 37 out of 50. So, all right, T1A5 on 7-5. It says, what proves that the FCC has issued an operator/primary license grant? So how do you prove you have a license to operate? It's called the FCC ULS, Universal Licensing System, I think. And you look up on that website, and that will show your call sign and if you're authorized and what privilege and your name and that sort of thing. Everything that's on that license grant will show in that database. So once you show up in the database, that proves that you have authorization and right to operate. That person does, whoever holds it. The next question is, how soon after passing the examination for your first radio license may you transmit? So when can you start using it? And the answer is as soon as it shows up in the database. So my understanding is the way it works now is once you pass the test, you fill out a form from the Volunteer Examiner Coordinator, or VEC, and they fill out a form, they transmit it to the FCC, and after a few business days, they will ask you to pay the fee for your license. I think right now it's about $35. You pay the fee, they process it, and then it will show up in the database, and then they will issue you a call sign according to the rules that I will go over in a few minutes. But once it shows up there, then you can now start transmitting using your call sign. You can download a PDF version of your license and print it out. You are supposed to always have your license with you whenever you're operating, okay? So you have to have it with you in the case of like mobile. Let's say you're out walking around or you're in a car or whatever, have it in your wallet. just like you would carry your driver's license around anytime you're driving. Carry your operator license anytime you're operating. Next question. What is the normal term for radio license? It's 10 years. Went over that already. Now, what is the grace period for renewal if it expires? And this is 2 years. So at the bottom of 7.5, it says there's a 2-year grace period. So if you forget to renew it, you have 2 years to do it. You can actually renew it 90 days before it expires. So let's say it expires January 1st, you go back 90 days, sometime October, November, December, you can renew it. So you got 3 months before that you can do it, and then you have a 2-year period after that you can renew without having to retake the test. If the 2 years expires and you forget, then you got to retake the test. So to renew it, you do not have to take the test, you just pay a licensing fee. Then the next question is, if your license expired and is still within that 2-year grace period, can you continue to transmit? No. If it expired, it's expired. You can't continue to operate. So pretty simple. 7-6. We talked about the volunteer examiner coordinators, or VECs. Those are just people that volunteer their time and means to administer these exams. Now, just kind of general part of the ham radio community. A lot of it's volunteer goodwill. There's a lot of kind and generous people that will donate their time and means to further the hobby and get you on board and teach you and stuff. So part of those are the examiners. And so the FCC has granted broad license to administer the license test. They even allow them to pool together and vote on and write the questions for the tests, and also administer the frequencies, which we'll get into a little bit later. So there's a form, CSCE, Certificate of Successful Completion of Exam. Once you complete and you pass, they'll fill out that form. And there's a form 605. There's a quick form. It's just your receipt that says, yeah, you've passed. You keep that as a receipt that you've passed until it shows up in the database. And then there's an example on 7-7 of what this form looks like. So I'm going to show you that really quick. Okay, so what this form has, it's got your name and information, a call sign if you already have one. Let's say you are a technician and you're taking the general class, you might have a call sign already. So you would put that. If you don't, you just leave it empty. There's a federal registration number, FRN, and you do have to register. I think before you take the test, you should register your information and you use that FRN to present to the examiner when you take the test. And then when you pass it, it ties that FRN, which is kind of like, think of it as like your name and your address and your social security number. That's tied to an FRN. And then once you take the test, they associate that FRN, which is you, that says you've passed it. They connect the two. So then you fill out other information like your email, your phone number if you want, what you're applying for, an upgrade or new license. And then it has the class of license you're trying, technician, general, extra. And then it has the 3 examiners. So there has to be 3 examiners to administer a test when it's present. They're like the proctors. There has to be 3, and they have to hold the license class above the one they're administering. So let's say they're administering a technician class. The examiners must be general or extra. They have to be one level up. For a general exam, they have to be extra or higher, but the exception is for an extra. Of course, there's nothing higher, so it has to be 3 extras that are administering the extra exam. And then they sign it. The 3 people sign it, and you sign it. And that's it for 7-7. 7-8. Okay, your responsibilities. 7-8. What happens if the FCC is unable to reach you by email? Well, they can actually revoke your license. So you want to keep it accurate, current, and up to date. Which of the following can result in a revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license? If they can't reach you by email or by mail, you have to put a mailing address. If it comes back unreturned, they can also revoke your license. So make sure you keep your email and address up to date with the FCC. Next question, when must the station and its records be available for inspection by the FCC? The answer, at all times. Just like a driver's license, an officer can pull you over at any time and ask for proof of your license. FCC can come in and inspect your station. They can look at your equipment and your license to make sure you're registered and your equipment is operating within the rules and the laws. So just keep that in mind. Next section, 7-9, bans and privileges. Okay, so there is a table on 7.2, most popular VHF and UHF technician amateur bands in ITU Region 2. ITU Region 2 is International Telegraph Union. That is basically North and South America, plus some of the Pacific Islands and Hawaii and Alaska and some other areas west. But we'll go into that in a few minutes. But those are kind of the most popular bands that are used across that region, which is pretty much North and South America. And the bands that we do in the U.S. are not 100% aligned with other countries, but they're close. So, for example, the 6-meter band is 50 to 54 megahertz. The 2-meter band is 144 to 148. 1.25 meters, 219 to 220. And then there's a little gap there from 220 to 222 that you're not licensed on. And then it goes 222 to 225. And then there's the UHF band, 70 centimeters, 420 to 450. Then you have the 33, the 23, and the 13 centimeters. And they're listed in that table on 7.9. Okay, so those are the bands. Which of the following frequency ranges are available for phone operation by technician license? So phone is voice. There is a table that tells you the modes and operations, and it's on 1-22 in the book. I'll come back to that in a moment, but it tells you the ranges, so it's a broad list that you have to know. It's those ranges that I went over just a minute ago in table 7.2, but the modes for phone operation for voice is listed in 1-22 in the book. Which frequency is in the 6-meter band? The 6-meter is 50 to 54 megahertz. That's a test question. It's good to know that. I haven't used the 6-meter band very much. I once had a friend who loaned me his Yaesu radio, and it was a 5-watt, and it was a tri-band radio. Tri-band, it was 6-meter, 2-meter, and 70 centimeter, so it was VHF and UHF. There are tri-band radios. They're just not as common. But I happen to own a VHF UHF one only. I only have the 2-meter and the 70 centimeter on that particular radio for transmission. But next question, what amateur band includes 146.52? 146.52 is within the 2-meter band. It's the 144 to 148. So all you have to know is 2 meters, 144 to 148. If you see any frequency that's in that range, you'll know it's the 2-meter band. On which HF bands does the technician class operator have phone privileges? So there is a 10-meter band that you have access to transmit on, and that's considered HF, which means you can go long distances on that one. I think when I got my license years ago, I don't think they had that. I could be mistaken, but I think it's one that's in the last 20 years maybe that they've opened up those frequencies for technician. So on 7-10, there's a great table here of all the different bands, and the black areas are the bands that ham radio or amateur radio has been allocated. It's called a frequency spectrum. So for example, AM radio like KSL 1160, that's within the MF, medium frequency range. And it goes from the 560 meter bandwidth to 186 bandwidth. You don't have to know that, but you can see that's where the AM radio stations are in your car. It's in this band here. And so on. You can kind of look at that table to figure out what that is. The other thing they show here, which you don't have to know, but interesting to note, there's a WWV frequency and time standard. So in the shortwave radio spectrum, there's a little beacon that transmits every second, and you can tune in and you can actually listen to it, and it transmits the time. And then every minute it will say, at the tone, it will be, let's say 7:21. It'll go beep, and then it'll go the next 60 seconds. And then on the hour, it'll say at the tone, it will be 8 o'clock p.m. or whatever it is, UTC. They might even say UTC, Universal Time Coordinated, which is GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, or in England. And UTC does not take account daylight savings, so it's kind of always the same as far as time zones. No matter what season you're in, it's always the same hour. And then you adjust for whatever country you're in as far as if they do or do not observe daylight savings time, or whatever area of the world you're in. That's just kind of a side note. Shortwave commercial broadcasting, they list those. The old TV channels that used to be the VHF and UHF, they show that here in 6 meter to 2 meter. There's FM radio broadcasting is in the 6 to 2 meter range as well. Channel 7 through 13 on the old VHF radio channels goes from 1.25 meter to 2 meter. You don't have to know any of that, but it's just kind of interesting to note. The UHF channels goes from 450 to 902 megahertz. That's the 70 centimeter to 33 centimeter range. That's where the old UHF channels used to be. I think they've since allocated that spectrum to other use, but that's where the TV channels used to be. All right, so HF technician licenses 711. There's a table on 7.3 that gives you the bandwidth, the wavelength of the band, and then the frequency and the modes that you're allowed to use when you get your technician class license. Okay, so the modes, 80 meters, you can do CW only. CW is Morse code. So they do let you use something in the HF bands worldwide, but it's only Morse code. So if you want to learn Morse code and you only want to get your technician, and by the way, general does not require Morse code. So even if you want to do more HF bands, you can just do the general and not even have to know the Morse code. But if you do want to go long distance with just a technician, you can try the 10 meter. But these other bands are 15, 40, and 80 meters, and they let you do Morse code on all of those. In the 10 meter, you have additional privileges as a technician, which is SSB, which is single sideband, that's voice. You can talk on the 10 meter band. They also allocate a section of the spectrum. It's 28 to 28.3 megahertz for RTTY, which is radio teletype, and data. RTTY is kind of like, it's terminal mode, but it's text and data. So they do let you do data over 28 and 28.3 in that range in the HF bands as a technician. I've never done it, but apparently you have privileges. All right, next section, 711 in the middle there. The next question, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? So Part 97, again, is what regulates the ham radio license in the US. Definition of a beacon, they tell you that later. I think it's the next page. It says the purpose of a beacon, it's called a beacon. These stations make transmissions for the purpose of observing propagation and other experiments. So you might put out a beacon on a certain section of the wavelength spectrum, and you just might transmit like beeps or something, or your call sign, and you might just say, maybe you publish it on a web page or something and say, here's my location, here's the frequency, here's my station call sign, and then people around the world will see if they can pick it up. And so depending on the propagation characteristics of the earth and the atmosphere and the sun and everything that's going on, you may or may not pick that beacon up. So it helps by having beacons there. If you heard a beacon yesterday and you don't hear it today, you would assume, unless they've taken their beacon offline, that the band is called closed. It's closed and it's hard to receive. If it's open, you could still hear the beacon from yesterday to today. So it helps you know, like, hey, this band seems to be closed. I'm not going to try to make voice contacts because I don't hear the beacon. So it's just kind of a nice way to know if the band is open or not. Next question. How may amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz segment of the 1.25 meter band? The answer is it's digital message forwarding only. So in that section of the band, they allow you to do digital messaging as well. So kind of like text messaging, forwarding kind of thing. T1B07. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? CW, again, is carrier wave or Morse code. There's two areas in the band plan, in the 2 meter and the 6 meter, that are just for Morse code. The 2 meter is 144.0 to 144.1, so it's 100. It's the bottom 100 kilohertz of that 2 meter band, and likewise for the 6 meter, it's 50 to 50.1, so it's the 100 kilohertz range of the 6 meter, and it's reserved for Morse code. And the reason they do that is because some modes conflict with others. If I'm trying to transmit, Morse code, and somebody's talking and it happens to bleed over into theirs, then it can interfere and cause problems. So they've allocated certain spectrum areas of the frequencies just for Morse code. And if everyone observes those, it makes usage of the spectrum much more efficient, and you don't have to conflict or create interference with other users of those bands. Okay, so there's a good, on 7-12, there's a good table of emission types. I think we went over this in a previous week, but I'll just review that. There's Morse code that we've been talking about, CW. There's data, which is kind of like computer or digital modes. There's images. You can actually transmit images on certain spectrums called fast scan or slow scan TV, also known as ATV, amateur TV. So you can have your own little TV station. I have never used this one, but tone modulated CW, Morse code generated by keying in an audio tone. Phone, which is speech. Pulse, just little pulses. RTTY, direct printing telegraphy received by automatic equipment. So this is a computer or teleprinter. Used to be called teletype, and they would do it over like a phone line. Well, you can do the same thing over the radio. So you just tune your teletype into that frequency and hook it up, and then it just starts printing messages of whatever it's receiving. So it's kind of like an automatic printer. They're just going and receiving and printing stuff. SS, spread spectrum communications, in which the signal is spread out over a wide band of frequencies. I've never used that, but apparently that's a thing too. And then there's test, a transmission containing no information. So those are different emission types. I've talked about beacons. The next thing is how much power can you put out, okay? In the middle of 712, what is the maximum peak envelope power? That's also known as PEP. Peak envelope power output for technician operators in their HF band segments. So in HF, it's below 30 megahertz, and the maximum power is 200 watts, okay? So you just have to know maximum power in the HF is 200 watts. The next question, except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power, PEP, for technician operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? So there are a couple of restrictions, but in general, the answer is 1500 watts. So you can do maximum of 1500 watts of power in anything above, well, not anything, in those areas above 30 megahertz. And there are some restrictions, exceptions to that, but just remember PEP is peak envelope power. So that's the maximum power you can put out. In the HF, it's 200 watts, and above that, above 30 megahertz, it's 1500 watts. There are some areas of the bands which it's only 150 watts. Anyway, we'll go over that a little bit later. Okay, 713. How are U.S. amateurs restricted in segments of bands where the amateur radio service is secondary? Okay, so there's what's called primary users and secondary users of the spectrum. So in an area that's considered primary, that primary user, like it might be a ham radio operation service, they are granted primary privileges. So if there's a secondary user, they can come in and transmit if no one's there, but they're not allowed to cause harmful interference to the primary user. So let's say there was an area that was for ham radio, and a secondary user might be FRS. I don't think that's the case, but FRS is the family radio service. So if they come in and operate on VHF, which they wouldn't do, but let's say that was a secondary user, they might come in and use it as long as you're not using it. And if you come in and want to use it, they have to kind of get off, right? So there's the primary and secondary users, and you're not allowed to cause harmful interference as a secondary user to the primary user. All right. Amateurs have a secondary allocation in the 70 centimeter band and must avoid interfering with radio location stations to have primary status. I'm not sure which radio locations stations, what that means exactly. That could just mean like beacons or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's just the example they give in the book. In the FCC, Part 97.303 lists all the frequency sharing requirements for U.S. hams. So you can go to the ARRL website and see that. Also, I should point out in this book, there are supplemental pages. You can go to the ARRL website and download the supplemental information. So that is available if you want to check that out. There's more information, but it's not in the test, so I'm not going to cover all of that. All right, now let's talk about repeater coordination from 713. So which of the following entities recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? So there's what's called a frequency coordinator. So frequency coordination, there's a list of them available on the website of the National Frequency Coordinators Council. So apparently there's a council, and they list regional coordinators for an area. So like, for example, in Utah, there's a frequency coordinator for Utah. It's called the Utah VHF Society, and they coordinate the UHF and VHF frequencies across all of Utah. And what they do is local amateurs get together, and they're selected by regional amateurs whose stations are eligible to be auxiliary or repeater stations. So I don't know exactly how this works because I haven't been involved in it, but you can go to the website, utahvhfs.org, and you can see the list of the band plan for Utah. You can do this for the other states. When I was in Colorado, I think it was called CCARC, Colorado Communications Radio something committee or something, but they had a list of all the frequencies within the state of Colorado. They also try to coordinate with surrounding geographic areas, like Colorado might coordinate with Utah, and Utah might coordinate with Colorado, and vice versa, because radio waves do not stop at political boundaries. If you're transmitting on one frequency in Utah, it might spread over into adjacent states if you're near those borders. So it behooves everyone to coordinate with adjacent areas and different frequency coordinators. So who selects the coordinator? The hams with repeater auxiliary stations. That's the question and the answer. And it's frequency coordinators. So you just have to understand that process. 7-14. Okay, international rules. Okay, there's a table here that has the ITU regions. There's 3 regions of the world. So apparently, according to the book, around 1949, there was an agency of the UN that was formed called the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. It was formed for working with international treaties and laws, including frequency allocations, according to all the UN countries that agreed to abide by these rules. So those countries that are part of that UN ITU agree to abide by those rules. They break them up into 3 regions. Region 2, as I was mentioning earlier, is North and South America. Region 1 is most of Europe, and it looks like it's Russia as well. I don't know. It kind of looks that way on the map. And then Region 3 is like Asia, Australia, and some of the Pacific Island regions there. And this is figure 7.4 on page 714. So just know that it's ITU, and in US we are region 2. It's kind of all you have to know. And also it includes, in the US, it also includes Alaska, Hawaii, and some of the US possessions and territories in the Pacific are also in region 3. So the US territories do cross into region 3 apparently. So that's what you have to know about that. Okay, 7:15. And we're almost done. We're getting close to the end. What types of international communications are an FCC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? So pretty much you can make contact with all countries unless they have been prohibited through the ITU. So there are certain countries that have said to the ITU, hey, we don't want you communicating with our citizens. In certain countries, I won't name them, but you can imagine what those countries are. They don't want people communicating with the outside world, and so you should honor and respect that and not communicate to those stations. And the same thing with the US. There might be rules about that. So T1D01, it says, from which countries are FCC licensed operators prohibited from exchanging communications? So apparently the FCC notifies the ITU of where they don't want people communicating, and you can go to the FCC website and find that, I guess. There's only a select number of countries, but they do exist. It also says it is, remember that in communications emergency, you can talk to any ham anywhere to prevent the loss of life or property. So that's a little caveat. I haven't been involved in those radio communications, but that's part of the rules as well. From which of the following locations may an FCC amateur licensed station transmit? It's from the U.S. and their territories, and also crafts that are flagged or registered in the U.S. So let's say you're on a boat, you're in U.S. territorial waters, you can transmit on your ham radio frequencies in those territorial waters. Outside those territorial waters, if you're on a U.S. ship, you can also communicate. Now, if you enter some other country's territorial waters and you're still on that ship, then you should abide by those international laws. Like, let's say you're going to Mexico or something. Mexico may have different laws in their territorial waters. Even though you're on a U.S. ship, you shouldn't be communicating if you're in violation of that territorial waters rules. So there are what are called like reciprocation agreements, where certain countries say, okay, you have a license in the U.S., maybe you come to UK. And they're like, all right, we honor that, and you can transmit in UK. I don't know if that's true, but there are countries where you can operate. Canada might be one of them. Okay, next section, 716. Call signs. This one's kind of fun. It can be confusing. There's this 10 call sign district on 7-16 here. There is a map of the U.S., and they've divided the U.S. into 10 districts. The call signs have a prefix and a suffix. So the mnemonic I like to use is AKNW. Now, AK is the postal abbreviation for Alaska, NW, Northwest. So I think the word Alaska Northwest, that helps me remember that AK and W are U.S. issued call signs. However, it's not anything that starts with the letter A. It's the prefix AA through AL. So AM is not U.S., but AL is. You just have to remember AA through AL is the U.S., and then K, N, and W. So if you hear a call sign that begins with AA through AL or K, N, or W, you know it's a U.S. issued call sign. In Canada, most hams use VA. I don't know if that's Vancouver, but VA through VG. French hams use F for French. Japanese use J for Japan. And Singapore have call signs beginning with 9V as in Victor. They just have that as an example. You don't have to know that, but you do have to know the prefixes for the U.S. So those call signs are, okay, I'm going to go to 717, and then I'm going to come back to the map. So 717 on page 75 has a group of call signs, group A, B, C, and D. Okay, so for example, group A is amateur extra. Group B is advanced, C is technician and general, and then D is technician plus the old novice and club licenses that are no longer issued, but those were in that class of license. So there's a prefix followed by a suffix, and in the middle of the prefix and the suffix, there's a number according to that 10 districts. So for example, my call sign is KC0 QZS. KC, K means it's the US, KC means it's a 2, and then the 0 is the call sign 0 district, which happens to be Colorado because that's where I got my license. And then QZS is known as the suffix. And so it's a 2 by 3. 2 prefix KC, a 0, and then the suffix is QZS, which is 3, so it's a 2 by 3. So 2 by 3 call sign is in the group D on that list. 1 by 3 is the general, and 2 by 2 is advanced, and 1 by 2, 2 by 1, and 2 by 2 is extra. So for example, let's take the call sign of my old friend N0AH or NOAA, November 0 Alpha Hotel. November is the first, so you know N is US. 0 is the 0 call district, which also happens to be Colorado, and these other states, New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska, and so on, as shown on the map. And then AH is a 2-character suffix. So it's a 2 by 1. So because it's 1 by 2. 1 is N, and 0 is the number, and then 2 AH. So a 1 by 2 indicates it's an extra license. So amateur radio has to have a 0 through 10 in it. If you hear a call sign like KSL, you notice they're all letters and there's no numbers in there. That means it's not an amateur license, it's another type of license, so it's an AM license, commercial, and so you know KSL is a commercial license, not an amateur license. WBL is, I want to say Maryland, Boston, I think. Anyway, there's different radio stations throughout the U.S. that have different call signs, so the lower the number, like KSL3, you also know it's a powerful station. It kind of indicates the power as well. So just remember that the by prefix 1 by 2, 2 by 2, 2 by 3, and so on, there's groupings of them. And so depending on your license, for example, the advanced is reserved for 2x2. That's an old class that no longer exists, but it's also reserved for extra. So if you hear a 2x2, you know it has to be advanced or extra. It can't be anything else. If you hear a 1x3, it could be general or technician. If you hear a 2x3, it's a technician, novice, and club, and so forth. All right, so there's also what's called a vanity call sign. In the middle of 717, who may select a vanity call sign under the rules? Any ham operator. So a vanity call sign is like, okay, kind of like a vanity license plate. You might want to personalize your license plate and say, I want this call sign, N0AH, Noah. And they're like, all right, well, you're an extra, so you have a 1x2, but let's see if that's available. And if it's available, they may issue you the call sign under the vanity call sign program. So they will issue you the next available number. It's kind of like a serial number, or like a license plate would be. They issue you the next available one, and then you can request a vanity one if you want. Which of the following is a valid technician call sign format? 1x3 or 2x3, according to that table there. So you have to know the technician call sign format. It's just 1x3 and 2x3. Apparently that's one of the test questions. The /0 is kind of interesting. This is just more of a side note. In the 1930s, let's see, it says the 10th district wrote their call sign with a 0 with a slash through it. It was created in the late 1930s when the population of the 9th district got too big, so they added the 0. And the slash was needed because in those days it was hard to determine between a 0 and an O. So they used an O, they did a backspace, and they hit the backslash through the 0, and then it became a 0 with a slash, and they still use that today. So when you see those zeros in there, you'll kind of recognize that's where it came from. All right, that's it for today's lesson. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Next time we'll be doing Chapter 8, Operating Regulations. Chapter 8 has 10 questions from the pool. Chapter 7 that we just went over has 17 questions from the pool. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.